Emails obtained by U.S. Right to Know suggest the top virologist may have privately discussed all theories of the pandemic's origin in the days after an article dismissed the lab leak theory back in February 2020. Journalist Emily Kopp reports that the group held discussions with Dr. Anthony Fauci and then NIH Director Francis Collins and wrote a report detailing the summary. However, more than 6 pages of notes from the February 7th discussion are now fully redacted.
It's not clear whether the group has concluded the virus arose naturally by that date or whether the lab leak hypothesis was still on the table. But one of the virologists that had set up the meeting was Jeremy Farrar, who emailed Fauci and Collins on February 4th and said he was split 50-50 between a lab origin and a natural origin, leading some to wonder what happened on that February 7th meeting.
Investigative reporter at U.S. Right to Know, Emily Kopp, joins us to discuss further, along with our very own Ryan Grimm, co-host of Rising Fridays. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So Emily, break down the latest for us a little bit. So it now seems like there was at least some serious discussion over this being a real possibility, prior to the kind of clamping down on any kind of dissenting discussion on this topic. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of it is hard to say because 6 pages of notes are redacted. It'd be a lot easier to clarify what was going on here if we knew what was under discussion. But just for background here, your viewers probably know, if they followed the story, that the lab leak theory was off the table for mainstream media and even censored on Facebook until about this time last year in 2021, when a cache of Anthony Fauci's emails were released under FOIA by the Washington Post and BuzzFeed. And while those emails were heavily redacted, they did sort of indicate that there were a series of discussions between Fauci and some of the world's leading virologists in the pandemic's early days about whether this new novel coronavirus that first emerged in Wuhan might have been related to the work going on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And even more striking, they showed that some of these virologists initially found the genome of SARS-CoV-2 to be inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. And about a month after these emails were released, Jeremy Farrar, who is the leader of this multi-billion-dollar biomedical nonprofit called the Wellcome Trust in the UK, who took a leading role in these discussions, he describes in his book being really torn up by the possibility that SARS-CoV-2 might have been generated in the lab. And, how after these series of discussions, he was really privately wrestling with this possibility and found it hard to sleep and wondered whether he should alert intelligence agencies. And all of this information was quite understandably a shock to the public and even to COVID reporters like myself, who had been told by these same world-leading experts in viruses that even the suggestion that COVID-19 resulted from a lab was beyond the pale. So a few reporters, congressional investigators, and scientists have for the last year or so been hoping to fill in the blanks here. How did we get from believing that the lab leak theory was possible on February 1st to describing it as crackpot just a few days later? And so, our latest finding is this February 8th email from Farrar on the morning of February 8th. He emails the head of the National Academy of Medicine outlining the latest summary of these teleconference discussions. And it was later forwarded with an attachment called summary February 7th.pdf. So that led us to conclude that one of these discussions happened on or around February 7th. Unfortunately, we don't know what the latest conclusions were because the notes are redacted.
Admittedly, I was one of those people that definitely dismissed this theory the moment I heard about it and never looked more into it. So I am delighted to hear more. Ryan, please.
Yeah, and to add to what Emily was saying, these are the critical dates, basically, February 1st, 2020, and then February 4th, 2020. And what's so interesting about what Right to Know has uncovered here is that it's February 8th, so it's adding on to that. So the reason that February 8th is so crucial is that that's the date of a conference call. We know that this happened. You had Francis Collins, you had Fauci, you had Dr. Anderson, I believe if Dr. Farrar wasn't on, he had somebody on for him. All of these top virologists meeting to discuss whether or not this may have come out of the lab. And coming out of it, you have Dr. Holmes, who later co-authors with Dr. Farrar this article in March, tamping down the idea of the conspiracy, saying that he believes it's a 60-40 like lab leak possibility. Farrar says he believes it's 50-50 lab versus nature. A lot of the other scientists on that call were all kind of overwhelmingly saying, we don't know either way, but they were somewhere between 50-50 or like 80-20 lab. Like all of the evidence on February 1st was leading these scientists to say, this is lab leak potential. Over the next couple days, something happens. So by February 4th, they're basically assigning themselves to write an article that becomes the proximate origins paper that then becomes used by Fauci and others to say, look, there's nothing to see here. All of these major scientists looked into this and have concluded that it couldn't have come from the lab. And those same scientists are the ones who were saying just days earlier that it looked like it did come from the lab, that they weren't sure where it came from, but it looked like it did. And so now, if you have some type of discussion going on February 7th, which is 3 days after they have concluded that they're going to write an article, a scientific paper, basically, saying that it didn't come from the lab, yet in private, they're still huddling and discussing whether or not it came from the lab. That's extremely interesting. Now, and Emily, I want to hear you talk a little bit about how they're responding to this, because I've seen them on Twitter saying, well, there was no teleconference, that it's wrong to call it a teleconference. And so they're making a very specific denial. But then when you press them and say, okay, well, what are these notes referring to? What happened on February 7th that this is a summary of? Can we see these 6 pages? And they're saying no. They're not sharing that. So what was it? And what is allowing them to say that there was no teleconference, assuming that they're telling the truth, that there wasn't a teleconference and there's some other discussion that happened at that time? They just won't tell us. So, Emily, what have you been able to learn from them or from other people familiar with this so far?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to clear this up. So what the email shows, and again, we're working with primary source documents here, right? We're working with emails that were sent that we were able to obtain through freedom of information laws. So they're sort of irrefutable in that way. So Jeremy Farrar says, here's the latest summary of our teleconference. He sends it on the email of February 8th. We know that there's an attachment called summary of February 7th. So that all is sort of irrefutable. We also know that Farrar said in his memoir that came out last year that there were a series of these teleconferences. Right. We know through another email that was released last year that Fauci told someone at CDC, I'm participating in a series of teleconferences. But so far, we only really know the details about that February 1st teleconference, which was before they started drafting this influential article dismissing the lab leak theory on around February 4th. So this February 7th summary could tell us a lot about whether, again, this reflected the scientific method or amounted to a cover-up. And just to clarify here, because I think there's been a lot of muddying of the waters on Twitter, I did reach out to everyone with firsthand knowledge of this teleconference and a few other people who I thought might have been forwarded this information to ask for the notes. You know, U.S. Right to Know is in the courts fighting to get documents unredacted so we can learn more about this. And I didn't hear from anyone until after the story published, at which point Christian Anderson, Scripps virologist who participated in some of these calls, said that there was no teleconference and that this was a conspiracy theory. And we, updated our story accordingly. But from my perspective as a reporter, not the most credible person at this point, because the only reason we know that these teleconferences happened and the only reason we know that the lab leak theory was in discussion at all is because of FOIA. The folks who were on this teleconference and who drafted this paper have not been transparent with the public about their process. So take that with a grain of salt.
That's incredible. And we're learning, of course, that grants from the NIH to study how MERS, which has a 40% mortality rate, obviously much more deadly than COVID, could evolve to better infect humans. And that research is currently being done at UNC and names animal models of human disease as critical reagents for therapeutics and vaccine testing.
We know that UNC had been studying coronaviruses before the pandemic actually began. ProPublica reports that at least 6 researchers were required to undergo medical monitoring following 4 incidents where they were potentially exposed to what the NIH now confirms were tubes of lab-created coronaviruses.
Right. So it just seems so, worrying, or at least something the public has the right to know a lot more about if there was this critical early, this isn't even an if, there was a critical early period where relevant scientists thought that a lab leak was as likely a cause as not of the origin, and then to go from that to you can't even talk about that without being run off social media, condemned for having spread conspiracy theories in the media. Ryan, what do you think about? And then but this research is still being done elsewhere in other contexts.
And that to me is the most critical question here. Accountability for the millions of people that were killed and the many more that were going to be killed through this pandemic obviously is important. But we don't want to, in a few years or a few decades, look back at COVID and say that was the gentle pandemic. Like we want to take a very close look at how this pandemic started so that we can write rules around what type of research is worth conducting scientifically and what type of research is simply too risky. And we had either last week or the week before on Rising, we had a debate between two biologists over this very question. And I went into it pretty skeptical of gain of function research and came out of that interview just frightened. And that was from hearing the absolute best case from one of the most well-respected researchers who's making the argument on behalf of continuing to do this research. And so even if it's only possible that it came out of this lab and was a result of this research, that's extremely important to understand because it has implications for what policy can be set. And it also helps to explain some of the ferocity around this question and why you're hearing so vociferously and so angrily and in such an unhinged way from so many researchers and scientists who are flatly dismissing the possibility that it may have come out of the lab because there is money and careers are at stake here. They are very much aware that the NIH through Dr. Anthony Fauci is very supportive of gain of function research and wants gain of function research to continue. There are people within the NIH who do not, but Dr. Fauci is on record saying that it is, the cost benefit analysis is clear that this is important stuff to be done. And so not only are these scientists, getting in the good graces of basically the sole grant maker in this field, but they're also defending their entire livelihood, the thing that they do. And I just don't think that somebody or a field as conflicted as that should be the one making this decision for the entire world.
I don't know if we have any working theories as to why they would cover it up, but I wonder, I know for me, I said I was someone that disregarded the theory the moment I heard it. It was less about what the theory was, and it was more about who were spouting the theory and the rhetoric around it. I know in the earlier days of the pandemic, there was a lot of xenophobia, and so I felt like, this was something being used to foster more hate towards Chinese people and Asian people, so that was the reason I dismissed it. So I'm wondering if there's something to that, to people not wanting to have the discussion, and even maybe the scientists not wanting that to be the narrative, why it would come out and then days later they would change it because of the way we went about discussing it. What do you have thoughts?
Let me make one point on that and then go to Emily. So what's in two things? Yes, anything that Trump says, the liberals, progressives, the left, myself included, we're very quickly be like, well, that's probably nonsense. But blind squirrel finds a nut sometimes. So that's one point. Second point would be Chinese scientists were the first ones to start floating the possibility that it may have leaked out of the Wuhan lab. So they obviously are not xenophobic. And many Chinese scientists, still believe that this is the case. So you can believe this without having some hostility to China
sure.
or Chinese people. But
absolutely.
Emily, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely, Ryan. I think for sure. I don't think any belief in what seems to be, a credible theory at this point, especially, right? 80-20, you said earlier, is pretty startling.
Honestly, if you had hostility toward Asian people, you would put this on uniquely specific to China cultural practices, like what goes on at wet markets. That to me actually seems like the more xenophobic explanation than research funded and conducted, supported by U.S. by white Western colonizing medicine.
I don't
people.
necessarily disagree.
That is what caused it. And the Chinese government is the lab.
I don't disagree. I don't think inherently discussing it or who's bringing it up is the problem. I think it might have just been in the initial days what it was being packaged and couched with.
Well, Emily, we'll leave you with the last word. What is the next step in trying to unravel this puzzle and understand, because that's what we just want to understand. Fine, if it was not a lab leak, fine. I have questions about this research, even if it's not a lab leak. I'm very skeptical of this research. We just really want to know the truth, and we want our scientists to be pursuing whatever the truth is, regardless. But we have a lot of concerns about the institutional need to kind of defend what's been going on and say that there's no way that could have caused these circumstances. So what is the next thing that your organization, the journalists should be doing to understand the picture a little more clearly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so just on the point about how this was couched at first, I think it's important to keep in mind that an investigation into how this pandemic started doesn't negate the need to also investigate what went wrong with the U.S. response. I think that's also critically important. But just as far as next steps, I think U.S. Right to Know has some good leads. I think one of the strongest might be, we know that NIH deleted some genetic sequences from its public-facing repository at the behest of scientists in China. And some scientists are curious, could there be other sequences that were deleted from the public-facing database that could help fill out the phylogenetic tree as to how this virus evolved and from where it evolved and whether it's natural or not. And we know that there are a lot of Republicans in Congress who are interested in digging into this and who are following our investigation really closely and are going to see, hey, these 6 pages of notes from this teleconference or summary of these teleconferences could be important. Let's subpoena those and find out what was going on. So if we see either the House or the Senate flip to Republican control, that could be another investigation that could shed more light on this.
Well, Emily,
let me do a real quick
Go
plug
ahead.
for anybody who's kind of new to this and skeptical of it. Allow me, this would be a good one for you. About a month ago, I did a podcast episode on my Intercept podcast called Deconstructed. It's about an hour long, with 3 of the journalists who've been doing great. Emily has done terrific work on this. I had a couple of Intercept journalists and another author on there who talk about how this unfolded from start to finish, and in a way that I think is pretty digestible for people. So you could just find it in the feed from about a month ago.
Beautiful. I'm gonna check that out. Ryan, and I encourage everybody else to check it out too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you, Emily, for your work on this. Is just so critical. We just want to know the truth. Shouldn't be so hard. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And stay with us, because we'll be back with more Rising right after this.